If the simple past is so simple, then why don't we use it all that often? Well, actually, even in spoken German, we do use it quite a bit. So today, we are going to level up our simple past. I'm going to show you 3 or 4 groups of verbs that often get used in the simple past. Grüß Gott, hallo, schönen guten Tag, ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 2. Herzlich willkommen. In our last couple of videos, we've been working on the past tense. And we made the point that there is really only one past tense form that we use most of the time. And that was, of course, the 2-part past tense. So what's the point then of learning the simple past? Well, we often hear that we only use it in more formal situations like writing. And that's true, I guess. If you look at most novels or maybe newspaper articles, this is the form that they use when talking about what happened. So most of us really just need to be able to recognize the verbs when we see them. And I think if you look at these verbs, then you'll probably be able to guess at their meanings because, well, they probably look quite familiar, assuming, I guess, that you know these verbs already. When writing, we've got lots of time, so we can spend time thinking about which verb to use in that second spot. But when speaking, we don't have that luxury, so we can hurtle into a sentence without really knowing which verb is coming up, and hopefully by the end of the sentence we'll have thought of a useful one to use. But we do actually use the simple past quite a bit. So I want to show you maybe 3 or 4 main sorts of verbs that we use very often in the simple past, even when speaking or just texting and that sort of thing. First up are these 2 familiar verbs, sein and haben. And if we're talking about ourselves, then of course we can start off with either ich war or ich hatte. Let's look at ich war first. Now you're only going to use this if you intend continuing on with one of these 3 things. With adjectives, you could describe the way you used to be in all sorts of ways. Here's me, for example, in some old photos. Ich war allein. Ich war müde. Or maybe ich war hier noch ziemlich jung. And there's a lot of prepositional phrases we can use with this verb too. So I could say, ich war in Schottland. Ich war auf einer Insel. Ich war mit dem Fahrrad unterwegs. And often a lot of these things are ways of describing location, of saying where you were. So of course they're actually pretty useful. And when we use nouns, we're often describing certain roles we used to have, like maybe, for example, ich war Student, or ich war Mountainbiker, or ich war Surfer. The only sort of words we're not going to use with ich war are verbs. So if you want to say, for example, the dog was sleeping, then you just use your normal past tense form of schlafen. Der Hund hat geschlafen. Now with ich hatte, our options are a little bit more limited, but we are really just going to use them with nouns, of which there are quite a lot. So we've got options like, for example, ich hatte einen Platten, or ich hatte Spaß, or ich hatte Hunger. And this brings us perhaps now to the biggest group of verbs that get used with the simple past, even when speaking, and that's our modal verbs. And these are not only super useful, but are also super easy to remember. Now, we've covered the modals in a previous video, so check that out if you're not really all that familiar with them or how they work. Now, what I like about the past tense forms of the modals is that we don't need to bother with all those pesky umlauts, which makes them easier to pronounce. Even just scanning down this list, you'll see that they follow a familiar pattern. Ich wollte, ich musste, ich konnte, ich sollte, ich durfte. Now, we're going to look at these 3 modals, but the others work in much the same way. Now, in the following examples, you'll notice that, as is pretty much always the case with our modals, our action verb is right at the end of the sentence in the form that we'd find it in the dictionary, so in the infinitive form. So the only past tense bit is the modal verb in the second position of our normal sentences, at least. If we're thinking about things that we wanted to do, we could say, wir wollten spazieren gehen, aber der Hund wollte nur in der Sonne liegen. Oder ich wollte Brot backen, also habe ich ein gutes Rezept gesucht. Oder ich wollte ein neues Auto kaufen, aber es war zu teuer. On the other hand, if we're thinking about things that we had to do, then we'll start off with ich musste, like in these examples.
Ich musste gestern eine Geige reparieren.
Ich musste gestern zum Supermarkt fahren. And here's a good opportunity to use our verb können in the past tense, which helps us to talk about things that we used to be able to do, or for that matter, maybe things that we couldn't do. Like, for example,
Beim Supermarkt konnte ich keinen Parkplatz finden.
or maybe, ich konnte die Wäsche aufhängen, denn der Regen hat aufgehört. So that brings us then to our last group of verbs that you'll hear often in the simple past in spoken German. And these are often I think, irregular verbs, such as maybe these ones. I'd suggest only learning these if you're already familiar with the two-part past tense forms. But here's some examples of them in action. Wir haben einen neuen Film angeschaut. Ich fand ihn ganz gut.
Ich fand ihn nicht so gut.
Oder ich hatte gestern ein Examen. Es ging ganz gut. Oder ich dachte, der Regen würde nicht aufhören. Jetzt scheint aber die Sonne. Wir wollten einparken, aber es gab keinen Parkplatz. So, although we mostly do use the two-part past tense when speaking, there are actually quite a lot of verbs that we also use in the simple past. And learning these can really, I think, help to level up your German. But at a minimum, start thinking about incorporating just a few of these words that we've looked at today into your everyday usage. Now, there's lots more info in our textbook, Bausteine zwei, so don't forget to check that out. Also das war's dann für heute und auch für dieses Video. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche und weiterhin viel Spaß mit der deutschen Sprache natürlich. Und wenn Sie Fragen haben, melden Sie sich einfach. Ich würde mich freuen. Have a great week, and if you have any questions, just get in touch, maybe drop a comment down below. Also auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.